you should read good detective fiction because it teaches you a lot about how to have an insight. Book number one would be the complete works of Arthur Conan Doyle, specifically the Sherlock Holmes short stories, in fact. And for several reasons. I mean, first of all, although he's not considered a serious figure in literature, Conan Doyle is an absolutely masterful prose writer. So if you want to learn to write clearly, and to think clearly as a consequence of writing clearly, it's a fantastic example. A few literati, like Kingsley Amis, for example, did actually point to the fact that many people from that era, if you think about it, it's kind of late Victorian, Edwardian era, are painful to read to modern English readers. He's not. There's a bigger reason, which is that you should read good detective fiction because it teaches you a lot about how to have an insight. I think there are very interesting kind of parallels between creative work, if you like, of any kind, detective work, and perhaps humour would be a third characteristic. All three of them possess some really useful they're almost sort of practice runs for having a useful insight in a commercial sense. There's the comedic skill of spotting something that nobody else has spotted. And that also occurs in crime fiction. And it also teaches you that actually surprisingly trivial things, anecdotal things, tiny little anomalies can be of huge importance. One of the worst things I think you can have as a detective, and one of the worst things I think you can have in our own business is a sense of proportion. In other words, if you're the kind of person who gets really, really annoyed if people start talking about small things or anecdotes or anomalies or outliers because you want to focus on the average, okay, you're the wrong kind of person for this job. And so actually, if you don't want to read those, read any kind of crime fiction or read true life crime or watch YouTube documentaries on how they catch serial killers. It doesn't really matter. But I think there's something quite important there, which is that if you look at good police work, it starts out with an investigative phase. Now, eventually you have to prove your case in court. But there's an investigative phase which precedes the evidential phase. Now, in the investigative phase, you may make use of, did anybody notice anything unusual? The peculiar incident of the dog in the night time. That's from a Sherlock Holmes short story called The Adventure of Silver Blaze. The point was the dog didn't do anything in the night time, which was the peculiar incident, and it suggested that the crime, spoiler alert, was an inside job because if anybody had broken into the stables to steal the racehorse, the dog would have been expected to bark or make some sort of noise. And, that's a beautiful example of spotting an asymmetric insight, the absence of something rather than the presence of something. And so, in any case, get involved in crime because it's enjoyable, and it's an enjoyable way to understand the process. Now, ultimately, this is where I think we get it wrong. We want to start with the data, and we want to start with things with evidential value. We want to start with hard facts. If you're trying to find out an ultimate truth, you won't be presented with that data to begin with. You have to go and find it. And quite often, the thing that leads to the capture of a major criminal is a surprisingly trivial seeming chance observation. So the Yorkshire Ripper famously, the son of Sam was caught, I think, because he got a parking ticket. And somebody remembered seeing a traffic warden, and they just wondered whether the perpetrator might have been given a parking ticket. Sure enough, he had been, and they went along to check on him. And before they went in to question him, they looked in the car, and they basically saw a load of guns and loony notes in the back of the car. And they thought, okay, this may not be a completely wasted visit. In the case of the Yorkshire Ripper, two of the cops, one of the decisive moments was they spotted that he'd parked his car the wrong way round. And this is because in the Bradford red light district, apparently, not a habitué, people normally park with their windscreen facing the wall so nobody can see what's going on in the back seat. In his case, he'd parked the other way around as if to make a quick getaway, which was indeed what he was planning. And they remembered this fact, and they went back and investigated, and sure enough found that he'd dropped a hammer and a screwdriver in the bushes while he was urinating just before they arrested him. And now that's evidential now, okay? But actually you've got to go through a kind of mount uncertainty, and you've also got to avoid becoming fixated on a few particular data points because they may not be true. The other case with the Yorkshire Ripper was they were convinced he had a Geordie accent because someone was sending in fake tape recordings. And actually you have to be prepared to let go of certain things in this process of investigation. As I said, I'm not against data, I'm not against evidence. You can't bang someone up for 40 years for parking in a funny way, okay? But those little things, they don't give you solid proof that you're right, but they tell you what to investigate next and where to direct your attention. Next book I'd recommend would be Obvious Adams by Robert Updegraff, which is a book of about 60 pages, which you can read in a single sitting. It was published in something like 1914 or 16 or something. And it's subtitled Obvious Adams, the story of a successful businessman. It actually details someone who works in advertising, funnily enough. But he doesn't actually do any advertising. His value to the business community is, again, in noticing things. In a sense, when I was given this book, I was just appointed as Ogilvy's creative director, and I was given a copy by Mike Walsh, who was the chairman of Ogilvy Europe at the time, and I was a bit insulted because it looked like a hokey kind of American business self-help book, which is exactly what it is, by the way, but it's still in print, and for a very, very good reason, which is that it's a very, very good guide to creativity through observation. And it was, funnily enough, one of David Ogilvy's favourite books. I didn't realise that. That's probably why Mike Walsh gave it to me. I was kind of insulted because I thought, I've just been made creative director. You should be giving me a subscription to the Harvard Business Review or The Economist. And instead you've got me this hokey Edwardian business book. And I kind of put it on the shelves in a bit of a huff until, I think, possibly for a trip to the loo, I just grabbed it one day and started reading it. And indeed, for the first 2 pages, I thought this is a hokey business book. But by the time I'd finished, I realised it was brilliant. There are moments of epiphany. And the problem I have in recommending a behavioural science book is that I can't remember entirely which one led to my epiphany. There was a very good one by a guy called, I think, Pete Lunn, if I'm right, which might have been the first one I read. Let me go and research this, actually. I think he's an Irish or maybe a British behavioural scientist resident in Ireland. And there's also a book by someone called Stuart Sutherland called Irrationality, which was very good. But I can't recommend him because he's a fairly member of the Sutherland family. He's no relation, by the way. I've got a vague idea that Pete Lunn's book was called Basic Instincts, Human Nature and the New Economics. And that might have been the first book I read that actually gave me the kind of, wow, this is really fascinating. I've got a vague memory I was ill, that I was ill with flu for about a week. I started reading some very good economics books, and I read various, there's The Armchair Economist by a guy called Stephen Landersberg, and I fundamentally had a kind of reading binge because with the flu I wasn't well enough to do anything else. And I found it absolutely fascinating. So that's Pete Lunn, who I think probably deserves a plug for that book. So I'll make that number 3. It sits with an awful lot of behavioural economics books, but the reason I give it quite a lot of prominence is I think it was the first one I read, and that was the one which was in a sense decisive in my thinking, because it was the first time I'd been introduced to behavioural economics with the suggestion that actually, as I'd always suspected, I was fascinated by economics because it was such an elegant theory, but I'd also worked in advertising long enough to know that it made ludicrous assumptions about human motivation, symmetry of information, perfect trust, you know the stuff, okay? I also knew enough about reality to know that these were not safe assumptions to make in any kind of real world setting. Outside the model, they struck me as just almost irresponsible. Now, nonetheless, I found, the whole thing extremely elegant, economics, and it is elegant. And by the way, sometimes it's useful. There are occasions where it's very useful. But the idea that it's necessarily the best idea you can have is the one that makes the most economic sense strikes me as fundamentally dangerous and wrong-headed. And then the fourth book, I will go on to the fourth book. The fourth book is, I'm going to be anomalous here, and it's actually, and I don't expect everybody to take it up. There is, oh crikey, it is, say, a book of Times or Telegraph cryptic crosswords. It could be Sudoku if you really hate cryptic crosswords, or in America they don't really have cryptic crosswords. They have them in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They exist in Hebrew and in Polish, I think. And they're very big in India. In fact, the Times of India has a very, very good cryptic crossword. But they don't seem to exist in the United States. So apologies for you if there are any American listeners. But it's very interesting because it effectively teaches you quite a lot about creative insight generation, which I suppose is sort of the gig I'm in at the moment. Many of us are. And partly because the clue always has an ostensible surface meaning, which is a distraction. Reading the sentence literally will not help you solve that clue. Okay. What you have to do is break it up unusually into one part of the clue, which is a homonym or synonym for what the answer is, and the other part which defines it cryptically, so that, for example, in a crossword clue, you might read the word does. Now, you immediately read that as does, okay? And everything in your brain is saying it's does. Now, the actual answer to that is deer, because DOES in that particular context means does, the plural of doe, a deer, a female deer. So that's the cryptic part of the thing, and effectively it's like an equation. So the first half is effectively the definition of the word that's the answer, and the second one is the cryptic constituency of that particular word. And the reason I think this is so useful is for several reasons, one of which is it teaches you to continually, if you like, reframe the question. It's a very, very good exercise in saying, well, we've been asked to do this, but does it really mean this? Or actually, why are we really doing this? It's a bit like the Dominic Cummings recommendation to ask why 6 times. When somebody says, we're going to, reduce train unpunctuality across the southern region, you don't just go, yeah, great idea. You go, why? And then you go, why again? And only after about 5 or 6 whys do you get actually close to the real reason. And then you can debate whether it's actually a good idea or not. And so it's that business of seeing beneath the surface. I do a cryptic crossword probably every day. I try to. But there's another thing about it too, and this is equally important, which is what it teaches you about the best way to approach problems. For example, this is just one example, very commonly you will be completely baffled by a clue to a point of just complete bamboozlement, and you'll go away, make a cup of tea, distract yourself, go and do something else, and you'll come back and the answer is apparent within 5 seconds. So it teaches you one of the things which I think is a creative tip, which is, in a weird way, you think the way to solve a problem, because we've been taught this is the kind of worthy Protestant way to solve a problem, is to apply yourself very, very diligently to the problem. But actually with crossword solving, it's the art of distracting yourself, that actually, if you're stuck, the very thing you should not do is persevere. And so there's a very particular kind of mindset which loves to start work early, start work straight away, keep on ploughing on in the same direction, no kind of recursion, no deviation, just stick focused on the task and do not let up, keep your mind nose to the grindstone, okay? Which seems like a very moral and correct, efficient approach and won't get you into any trouble at work, but it's actually a very, very bad behaviour if you're trying to solve a problem imaginatively or indeed, really effectively. Because there are two parts of life. Okay, there's the literal part of life where what makes sense is also what makes most sense is most likely to work, and there are areas of engineering and physics and chemistry and so on which effectively fulfill those requirements. And then there's a large part of life where actually what works and what makes sense may be quite divergent. The thing that makes the most sense may not work all that well. And the problem with those areas of life is that if you pretend that second class of problem belongs to the first class of problem, and you basically act as though this is a quest for a rational solution to the problem, based simply on sequential logic, you will look like a really good person dedicated to solving the problem. You'll never get I think an awful lot of protest is actually counterproductive. All right? You think you're signaling that you care about the problem. Actually, in many ways, what you're doing may be losing support for your case. Okay? And so what I think is vital about cryptic crosswords is it's a very good exploration both into the I suppose you might say the habits of thought that you need in order to crack problems where the literal approach is effectively likely to fail. In fact, the worst thing you can do with a cryptic crossword is read it literally. Because, and of course, it's very interesting with market research because it's the whole question of kind of, okay, this is what they're ostensibly saying, this is what they really mean. You know, it's that kind of thing. I mean, an interesting one, if you want the modern version of Obvious Adams, I'm going to end actually with a film recommendation, which is The Big Short. And the reason I recommend that film is because, of course, there were lots and lots of people who had lots and lots of self-serving theories about collateralized debt obligations and, you know, synthetic CDOs and whatever. Okay, what distinguished, not all, but most of the team is they went and looked. They went to Florida and looked at what was really happening in the housing market, and you know they went to Vegas and they looked at the extraordinary kind of over ebullience of the people involved in the business. And they realised there was a flaw, but they noticed things that other people didn't notice or didn't want to see.